Dr. Chris Hardy and William Walker will take a deep dive into topics covering wellness and prevention, performance, recovery, and injury management. Our mission is to provide the latest science-based information to help you get the most out of your grappling journey, both on and off the mats, and help you overcome any challenges you may be grappling with. Dr. Hardy is a licensed physician and BJJ practitioner, but the contents of the podcast are meant for educational purposes only and should not be taken as medical advice. Please seek out personalized care from your own medical provider prior to implementing any medical treatment or intervention.
All right. Welcome to episode 4. You happy to be here?
I'm on the table.
You are on the table.
Choked Brittany out.
Did you really?
Yeah, I locked Andrew out. I'm here.
Oh,
It's all me.
that's awesome, man. Well, congratulations on that. So this one is a pretty ambitious podcast we have. I would say this episode is probably going to be one of our foundational ones that we're going to probably refer back to. Some of it is pretty sciencey.
Nerd alert.
Yeah, big time. I'm going to really do my best to keep it as layperson friendly as possible, and I'll definitely interrupt me if I start getting going off on something that's really esoteric and
Yeah.
So we're going to talk about stress today, and something I like to call the stress cup. And this is adapted from a lecture I gave, I think back in 2015, to a large group of personal trainers at a conference, talking about overtraining, and so it's really I've adapted it to our community, our grappling community. So hopefully you guys get something out of it.
Can I interrupt just right off
please
the bat?
do.
It's what I'm good at. Olivia knows. And
Yeah, super annoying. Too.
Yeah. And I need to just rewind to the previous episode just for a moment.
Oh, I love it.
I brought up a recipe that is for people that are trying to get some protein, and they don't like Greek yogurt. They feel like it tastes like baby poop.
Okay.
And if you're someone that's familiar with baby poop taste, you can't eat Greek yogurt because it's the same.
Do you mean you think it tastes like baby poop?
I think it tastes like baby poop, and other people do also.
Okay.
Not everyone. Some people like baby poop. So I set a little recipe that makes it taste like a bowl of acai.
Right.
I just want to go over it one more time. And then if people try it, please let me know.
Did you get some pushback on this?
No.
Oh,
I
you
just thought
wanna...
about it, and I just want to drive it home. And I want to know if other people think similarly, where I hate Greek yogurt, but now I can't get enough.
Ooh.
You hate all yogurt.
True. Not just Greek yogurt.
Not just the Greeks.
No, it's all
Okay.
poop,
Okay.
baby poop.
So please.
Okay. So I would say 1.5 cups to 2 cups of the yogurt, said yogurt.
Mm-hmm.
What was the good brand of yogurt that we got?
We got Siggy's.
Ziggy's?
Siggy's.
Siggy's. It's all good stuff in it.
Okay.
So it's a good choice. You do a scoop of your protein powder.
Mm-hmm.
Which one tastes bad? It has egg in it or something? Remember we did one and it was too eggy? A protein powder?
Oh, because it was literal egg whites.
Okay, it was an egg white protein powder.
Oh, that makes sense.
Yeah, too strong. Mm-hmm. So you got to do one with, we just use a normal whey. Mm-hmm. Vanilla is my personal pref. And then I do 6 drops. You have your tincture of stevia that you get from any Whole Foods or whatever. 6 drops of stevia, 2 tablespoons of monk fruit. Mm-hmm. Okay.
Tablespoons?
Whatever you eat soup with. Is that a tablespoon?
I don't know.
You guys are killing me.
Okay, I'm sorry. I need to know if people feel the same.
Okay.
And I slice up probably 4 good-sized strawberries, a banana, sprinkle in some blueberries, pretty healthy amount. Mm-hmm. All I'm saying is let me know, people. Let me know.
I love it. I like how passionate you are about it, too, which is
It's my own concoction.
especially from a person that previously felt like it tastes like baby poop.
Yeah. I mean,
So
You taste baby poop once, my friend, you don't want to go back.
well, I think Brittany took on that idea anyway. She kind of gave me some feedback already of the yogurt.
She
type of
did?
thing. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
So we'll follow up with her.
I just need to say, Bill, I'm pretty sure I'm the one who made that, and then I shared it with you. So you're trying to take some cred.
I'll concede.
Okay. Good job.
Thank you.
Stress episode.
Excellent. So again, this was adapted from a lecture I gave, and I'm gonna try to make it not sound like a lecture as much as possible because that would bore people to death. Exactly. He's already sleeping. So one of the questions, and I have notes here so I can keep on track as always, so I don't get all crazy and I'm all over the place. But you may have get the same question from especially people newer to grappling jiu-jitsu. How do you know how often to train in general without overtraining? Or another question we get is how much exercise can I do in addition to my grappling, which I think are two pretty common ones. And then kind of the meat of this thing is, how do I get the optimum dose of training on any given day? Because we don't want to undertrain and not do it hard enough, but we don't want to overdo it consistently to cause us problems and have performance issues and all that. So is this something you guys have come across or just thought about yourself?
I mean, this is we'll call it a discussion in the household for years because we fall a little bit on two sides of the proverbial horse where I would say, well, she's going to say that I say that you can't train enough and that you can't train too much. She's going to lie to people and say that.
Excuse you.
And say that you say that?
Yeah, that you can't overtrain.
But she's right here.
So I'm just saying she's conveying my opinion incorrectly. But where we really differ is I will lean on the side of training more. And let's say you just show up and you go through the motions. That's, to me, that could be a day of training. You just didn't skip a day. She might fall on more of the, interrupt me if I'm wrong, Pookie, that that she would take the day off, not day off and have McDonald's and stuff like that.
No, I get
but
it.
the overtraining thing can be real. We think we ran into it with her before where she did and she was floored.
Well, yeah, or like if you're had a bad night's sleep and you're really tired, maybe it would be better to take a nap,
Or a day off.
or a day off.
You guys are hitting, I couldn't have planted those questions and comments better. Because that's exactly what we're going to talk about here. Because
we constantly argue about like what we should do in those moments.
And guess what? Just like nutrition, it's individual to what's going on. And that's what we're going to talk about. Because, how do you reliably prevent overdosing exercise, but still train hard enough to get gains, right? And that's the balancing aspect, and that's
part of that is what are you trying to get gains in, right?
Well, sure. What are you trying to, of course, when you're trying to train anyway, what are your goals, of course, is important. But let's say you have something set, how do you go about doing it to make sure you still get that input that you need for adaptation, but not overdo it to the extent where you start regressing, which can happen. So when I get a problem like this, and this is kind of how my mind works, I want to go back to, when I want to get a solution for it, I like to go back to, what we call quote unquote first principles. Basically, what are the underlying foundations for whatever problem we're talking about? Because I like to have a conceptual framework when we develop something like this. For instance, before we could build a space shuttle as human beings, we needed to figure out how to make fire, right? So if you take the same approach, physics is really good at this from mathematics, coming from first principles and building up mathematics, physics, chemistry, biology, right? And so that's kind of the hierarchy when you were getting a foundational principle for anything you want to kind of discuss. So basically, that's how we build a conceptual framework for this stuff. But have you guys ever thought about, what is exercise anyway?
I think I've thought about like, what am I doing to my body?
Yeah, but I mean, what is it?
Movement.
It's movement requiring some type of energy.
Done. Yeah.
Right? Mm-hmm. And we do it to do what? What's our goal?
Well, I would say health and fitness, mental clarity.
A bunch of a bunch of different goals. Or maybe you have a performance goal. Maybe you have a sport you like to do. But it's to get an effect out of it. But sometimes we forget that exercise is a form of stress. It can be beneficial stress, but it's still stress. Then the next question is, I know I'm asking a lot of these rhetorical questions, but then what is stress? Mm-hmm. You guys ever thought about that? I mean, that's something, we say it all the time, don't we?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
We're like, oh, I'm stressed out, or, this thing, I'm stressing this point, or, what is it? They've actually had a couple scientists back in the 1930s. Hans Selye, Selye.
Oh,
not Sol. That's pretty good. He said that stress is the non-specific response for the body to any demand for change. If you think about what that means, we have environmental inputs, whether they're exercise, whether they're, life and limb type of issues. Our body has to respond to those, to a demand for some type of change. What's interesting, though, is stress for the engineers out there. I know we have a couple in our academy. It actually was an engineering term before this, where it basically means the amount of force per unit area. But no one outside of an engineer, uses that definition. But what we use, we always, like I said, we in our culture, we think of stress as being stressed out or being under a lot of stress. But basically, anything that triggers a stress response is a stressor. I mean, it sounds obvious, but it's important to kind of break this stuff down and kind of build back up if we're going to get some answers here. So, there's good and quote unquote bad stress, right? So food, water, activity, work environment, traffic, danger. What about internal stresses like disease, worrying, rumination, things like that, where it's coming from within? Are all those things good or bad? And I guess it depends. Because let's be very clear, acute short-term stressors are necessary for our survival. It's how we build resilience. How we are
short-term stressor.
Yeah, like in other words, I do something for a short amount of time, like exercise, or I have to run away from a predator.
Mm-hmm. So
right.
Literally in the sense of time, like we're not in the moment for very long.
Very exactly. And that's what I mean by acute short-term stresses, as opposed to things that I would argue that many of us live under in our society now, where we call it chronic stress, right? And whether it's sitting in traffic for 2 hours a day because you got to commute to work, you're worried about, you have a high-stress job, you're worried about that. You're having family issues at home, financial worries. All these things that are kind of constructs of the modern environment, that what's interesting is our brains really aren't adapted to deal with this. It's like a death by 1,000 cuts type of thing, as opposed to having like an acute, okay, here's danger, I got away from it, now I can recover from that. I don't live in that the entire time.
This kind of goes into
where.
Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Well, I guess this would kind of go into that overstimulation from like our cell phone, and you look at Twitter or Facebook and you got that news feed.
24-hour news cycle.
That's
exactly right. And so all these things are sources of stress, and they weren't really present as we came up as a species to them. We were more of most of the time we kind of lived in a little more chilled out and not having this constant onslaught of this low level, underlying stressors from the environment. And many people have argued our brain and body just aren't adapted to that. And, they would argue that it causes a lot of chronic diseases we see now. So if you think about what the brain is, it's basically our command center for evaluating and responding to the external environment. And so to talk about stress, it's really important that we kind of break that down a little bit without getting too sciencey. But I think it's important for us to understand what's going on under the hood just a little bit.
Let's go for a ride.
Yeah. So if you think about what is the stress response, if I was walking out the door here to the studio and Olivia was hiding behind a corner, and jumped out and scared me.
About to get judo chopped in the neck.
That's right. And she can handle herself. She's a purple belt,
Get wrist locked.
Right. So what happens during that? Generally we have, and this is really oversimplified. So, those people, saying, well, I want to get into the nitty gritty.
Sure,
That's not the purpose of this.
Basic example. Yeah.
Very basic and very simplified. You have something in your brain called the hypothalamus. That is this little tiny structure in the middle of the brain, which then communicates to the pituitary gland, which then goes down to the adrenal gland. People have heard of the adrenal gland. When you have an acute stressor like Olivia scared me, we have a very quick response. That surge of adrenaline, and the heart rate goes up and all that.
There's like an intensity to your neck and
yes,
chest.
all that type of that reaction. That's basically part of the fast response to stress, where you have that signal goes from the hypothalamus directly to the adrenal gland, and we get a huge dump of norepinephrine and epinephrine, which epinephrine people call adrenaline.
So you said, we've all heard that adrenal gland term.
Yep.
Can you briefly what is the adrenal gland?
So it's a little gland that sits on top of the kidneys.
Okay.
And it's responsible for a bunch of hormone production, especially our sex hormones. It's responsible for our hormones responsible for volume control in the kidneys, and also deep into the adrenal gland is where we secrete things like adrenaline.
Okay, so that's why it's going to pump out a little shot because I'll get that feeling. I'm a psycho. I don't know.
Yeah.
Maybe I'm just a normal person. We all get this, but if I get a text message from a customer, your boss or whatever it is, whatever the scenario, and this literally just happened. I had a customer text me and say, I need you here today. And I was like, okay, any particular time? As soon as possible. I got that hit.
That's right.
Where I was just like, oh my gosh. I started planning okay, I'm going to have to live with less income because they're going to cut us as soon as I get there. I'm like, they're not going to use me anymore. Whatever it is. And I started going through
stress response.
Yeah.
Exactly. And the initial one is that kind of heightened response is the adrenaline, what we call epinephrine, norepinephrine. And then we have a slower response. It takes a little longer that goes through the pituitary by way of the pituitary gland. I'm not going to go through all the intermediate hormones, but it causes the adrenal gland to secrete cortisol, which is a stress hormone. And so that happens a little slower, kind of after the fact a little bit, and that helps part of the recovery. And because the brain's like, oh, we have a stressful situation, cortisol helps things like mobilize blood sugar, decrease the inflammatory response. It has a lot of different actions.
But it's a
stress hormone.
We get it from a stressful situation.
And we do have it is part of a natural secretion. That's what wakes you up in the morning.
So I assume
it's cortisol.
We'll get to cortisol a little bit deeper.
We sure will.
Okay.
But anyway, that's kind of that's part of the basic the stress response. And so also the part of the nervous system that really, that's kind of the command center, but what it really affects is two parts of what we call the autonomic nervous system, which is you have the sympathetic, which people may know as the flight or fight system. That's what, like when Olivia scared me, that's what caused my heart rate to go up. It dilates my airways to get ready for a flight or fight.
That's what's telling the adrenaline gland to pump out some stuff.
Well, that's that's exactly right. That's the epinephrine, norepinephrine is part of that sympathetic response. Exactly. Energy mobilization, right? To get energy, because obviously we're stressed, and the brain nervous system doesn't distinguish between stress. It just knows there is a situation and we have to do something about it. So it's not like, and we'll talk about the other regulators here in a second in the brain. The other side of the flight or fight, you have the sympathetic flight or fight, then you have the parasympathetic, which, a lot of people have heard this stuff before, but, it's worth going over again, where that's what brings my heart rate down after I've been, okay, got to calm down. That's what that is. The heart rate comes down. It's also, instead of energy mobilization, it's an energy storage. It's like, okay, we've had a stressful response. Now let me accumulate some more energy for later use. It's also, instead of being inflammatory, promoting inflammation, it's anti-inflammatory. So, Olivia, I think you had a question on why is the sympathetic nervous system inflammatory by nature?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a really good question. If you think about that, during a flight or fight response, there's a potential for one of the things is there's potential for injury. You think about that, just we're in a dangerous situation, so the immune system goes up and creates an inflammatory response. So if you have inflammation is required for wound healing and things like that. It's one of the reasons why.
That's why we have swelling and all
that's
that
exactly
sort of
right. That's
on
right.
Your knee hurting or your back or something.
Right. That's the stress response related to that sympathetic nervous system. But we need a balance to those things. And you can imagine if we live in a low-level flight or fight in modern society, we have this chronic low-level inflammation that we've never had to deal with before as human beings, as opposed to the last this constant onslaught, I guess. So it's really important that we try to live in a state of parasympathetic dominance. In other words, that should be the most active most of our day. And the sympathetic nervous system is there when it needs to be, as opposed to sitting there and, whether you're, someone cuts you off in traffic, you're getting yelled at by your boss, or, this constant onslaught of, this high level of sympathetic nervous system. So it's really important to understand those two, kind of how they, and I've represented it graphically as almost like a yin and yang symbol. You need them both. It's yang is how you pronounce it.
Is this like Andrew
Jang?
That's
not how you pronounce his name. You can ask him.
I did.
Yeah.
We split a French toast together and told me the correct way.
It's Jang.
I'll concede again. So you said it's yang? Yang?
Yang.
Y'all.
Yang.
Y'all. Remember that movie?
Yes. But anyway.
I'm happy you have notes because
I do think, because otherwise, I'd go way off track. Yeah, it'd be pretty rough for me. Now, we've identified that on what what's kind of the master controller of the stress response and what happens when the stress response is activated. But there's some additional kind of governors of that in the brain, so-called our higher functions. That's where human beings have a prefrontal cortex. It's that front of the brain. It's responsible for what we call executive function. Basically using higher reasoning. So we can step back from a situation and say, hey, is this really a threat? Or am I just reacting to something? Perfect example. If we were walking in a jungle and known to have poisonous snakes, and up ahead, we see something long and cylindrical in the path, the reaction would be, oh crap, that's a snake, stress response. But if you've been down that path enough times and you're like, well, yeah, this part of the jungle really doesn't have a lot in there, you're relying on your memory of past experience, which is from the hippocampus, and then your prefrontal cortex says, hey, we've been here before, and it's unlikely that there's going to be a snake. There's probably a stick. So that is how we control the stress response through our higher functions. Whereas if every time you walk down a path, you got bitten by a snake, that's where the amygdala, which is another brain structure, takes place. That is responsible for learned fear. Perfect example, the classic studies, if every time I made a bell noise, I gave you an electric shock.
Or a dog treat.
or a dog treat. But in this case, an electric shock, because we're talking about the amygdala.
Oh, okay.
So every time you hear that bell, you're going to have a stress response if your previous experience has been followed by a shock.
Right.
So the amygdala becomes very good at that's learned fear. And so the problem is when the brain is normal, in other words, we're not living in constant onslaughts of stress from all different causes, we have a good balance between the amygdala, which initiates that stress response, and then the other two, the prefrontal cortex and the hippocampus, then are like, hey, wait a minute, let's think this through type of thing. So we have a good balance, and it's appropriate then at that point, so we can reason. If we are, and you probably know people like this, and I have experienced it myself in times in my life where I've been stressed so much, so often, that I become very reactive. You hear people say, I'm in a bad mood, or, it's like, what's the difference if someone cuts you off in traffic for you like screaming out the window at them, or like, that is what I'm saying. So if the amygdala becomes dominant, we become more animal-like and more reactive. And this is an important point. I'll let you ask your question in a second. The brain actually changes in response to chronic stresses. It's called neuroplasticity.
Response becomes, it morphs from that kind of even
to more of a dominant, where the amygdala is in control most of the time. And if you think about it, that makes sense from a survival perspective, because if the brain perceives it's constantly under threat, it wants to make the stress response active much more easy to do. It's not good for our health, because then we're in this low-level sympathetic nervous system response, this low-level inflammation all the time, driving chronic disease. Diabetes, high blood pressure, cancer, you name it.
So fear is basically controlling your life?
That's right. Which would make sense. And what's interesting is if you guys heard of epigenetics, we all know what genetics are, and I've talked about epigenetics before. Epigenetics is basically bookmarking some genes that we use all the time from environmental influence. So if I am in my mom's womb as a fetus growing up, and my mom's under an incredible amount of stress, epigenetics says that it's going to, as I'm developing, it's going to bookmark those genes to make them express more related to supporting the stress response, because I'm in my mom's womb, she's under a lot of stress. So evolutionarily, if the physiology says, well, you're going to be born to a stressful environment, so we need to have a very robust stress response. There's Holocaust survivors 3 generations later that it's inheritable. So they have a increased stress response for something their grandparents and great-grandparents went through. So it can be, we can talk about epigenetics in another episode because it's a really important concept. That can be reversed over time, but you have to give the brain a big environmental input the other way to kind of reverse that stuff, because it's a survival mechanism.
So something like a hypochondriac now.
Okay.
Or because typically everyone knows, 1 or 2 people that are obsessed with getting sick, or they just have a tremendous amount of anxiety about whether it's all the way to death or getting sick or going through some sort of unhealthy moment.
With those people, typically, not everyone, everyone's situation is different. It's usually triggered by some type of early stressor.
Early
in life,
like
childhood, or even it could be even. And there's a nature versus nurture argument to all those type of things.
If the parents are like that, then it's going to just promote it even.
Well, of course, because it's creating a stressful, and the child sees that, oh crap, I'm in danger all the time.
I mean, they have to, if someone is falling into that hypochondriac kind of mode, they have to, I would assume, have some of those things that you were talking about, heart issues, diabetes, they're going to just go down the list of all those.
Ironically, because it creates anxiety, which creates a sympathetic nervous system response all the time, And ironically, the people that are worried the most about that in turn can lead to poor health.
Right. So then they are constantly sick.
So, well, but true.
Yeah.
Yeah, because and so that's a really good example. But again, and that's where we got to understand that there are structural changes to the brain that have taken place over years in response to a perceived threat. It doesn't matter if the threat is real or not. It matters what the brain is perceived as threatening based on learned experience. And
which could be a not real threat.
Yes.
Your news feed.
Correct.
About something happening in Florida.
That you have no control over.
Or you're almost in a car accident or something like that.
Correct. The brain doesn't differentiate. And so the important thing to realize, it's not psychological at some point. The brain has actually changed, and believe it or not, there is actually shrinking of the prefrontal cortex and the hippocampus with chronic stress. Literal. And the amygdala actually gets more powerful and actually grows more neurons. So we're actually creating a different structure in the brain over years.
You can reverse that.
You can, but then it takes an input the exact opposite.
Anything.
Yep.
Okay.
It's like getting really, really overweight.
Yeah.
It takes a while.
You're digging yourself out of a deep hole.
You are, but it can be done, and that's really important. So, but anyway, yeah, that was a really good example. So when we look at stress, we often focus, especially in our community in jiu-jitsu, we look at, because we know jiu-jitsu is physically probably one of the most demanding martial arts as far as on your body, as far as stress on your body. I would argue
arts, yeah.
wrestling,
Judo.
grappling arts, yeah, for sure. But we usually just focus on the physical stress of training when we're talking about how much should we train or what kind of stress. And we got to consider other sources of stress when we plan our exercise and recovery. So, and to do that, we need kind of a concept to kind of evaluate that and in a thought process to do that. And that's kind of where we get into a really interesting scientific principle. I think Dr. Bruce McEwen coined this long ago. I can't remember the exact, maybe in the late 80s, early 90s. He called it allostasis. Have you ever heard that? I know Olivia's done some reading. You probably...
Halitosis.
Exactly. No, not bad breath. Allostasis just means stability through change. People have heard of homeostasis. Have you heard of that word?
I've heard it.
Yes.
So our body has a bunch of systems that have what's called homeostatic mechanism. In other words, it wants to maintain those. Temperature is a perfect example. Our body temperature, that thermostat stays, for most people between, I don't know, high 96s and 98. It's pretty close in that in a very, very, our electrolyte balance is another one. Blood pressure. All these things the physiology tries to keep that stable at one level. That's called homeostasis. Allostasis just means we're trying to achieve stability, but body has to change to do it. Perfect example is exercise. If I'm lifting weights, the brain says, we got this physical stress going on from the environment. And this isn't the thinking parts of the brain. It's the responding parts. We got to do something to make sure we're able to respond to this stress. So what happens? Muscles grow. For runners, we get increased mitochondrial density. So we have an adaptation so we can maintain some sort of stability with what the environment is putting at us. Does that make sense? So instead of staying at a certain level, we're actually changing to maintain that equilibrium. Does that make sense? Olivia, did that make sense to you?
Yes.
Okay, let me know if it doesn't, because if it doesn't make sense to you guys, someone else can be like, I don't know what the hell he's talking about.
She might not understand that part.
What?
Excuse you.
She might not understand.
Excuse you.
Well, we don't want to go down that route, because if I know Olivia pretty well, and
I'll
she
be muted for the rest.
I was going to say she has very insightful questions. So, but that's what allostasis means. It's just stability through change. So with stability with our body, with the external environment. So in response to, guess what? Stress. So, like I said, allostasis really means a successful adaptation to an environmental challenge. What are those challenges? Exercise, physical activity. Starting a new job at first, you're maybe stressed about it, but once you get the lay of the land, you build resilience. Mm-hmm. The first time I did big wave surfing, scared out of my mind. Mm-hmm. You develop a familiarity with it, and so resilience is another.
Doing tournaments or something.
Yeah,
like that.
Perfect example of what jiu-jitsu, doing tournaments. Like the first guy, I would argue, but for a lot of us, it's still, that stress response is pretty big. But the more you do it, the more resilience you build up to that. Mm-hmm. And that's allostasis too. So it's stability through change. Now you're more resilient to maintain an adaptation to whatever you're throwing at your body and brain. Does that make sense so far? Mm-hmm. So, too much or too little of a stressor can cause problems depending on what it is. We all do need some kind of stress. That's how the body adapts. If you just sit laid around without doing any exercise, the body deteriorates. Mm-hmm. You see in astronauts, when they go into space without gravity, they quickly have muscle wasting. And this is the same thing where not getting enough stress is a real problem too. So that kind of leads.
You're calling exercise stress.
Yeah.
So that almost confused me there.
Exercise is stress.
Almost got me. Threw that little sucker in there.
Yeah, you like that? So let's talk about a training challenge. So let's talk about allostasis in training. What happens to adapt to that training load? We get an endorphin release, like the runner's high, when they're really pushing it, you get that. That is allostasis. It's like, hey, that's a stress response, not necessarily a bad one. You get growth hormone secretion. You can get muscle hypertrophy, building bigger muscle. And I've already talked about what we call mitochondrial biogenesis, which just means making more mitochondria, which are the powerhouses of the cells for aerobic metabolism especially. So you see a lot of runners built up. They get more mitochondria, so they have more aerobic capacity. So, and if you overdo these stress responses, even these good ones, it changes from allostasis, meaning stability through change, to what we call allostatic load. That means we've exceeded the amount of stress our body can handle and still make a positive adaptation. So, and that is where, so I'm going to keep myself organized here. That's where I came up with, but a way I thought about representing this is the concept called the stress cup, where use the visual representation of a cup to represent your body's capacity, body and brain's capacity for dealing with stress at any given time. And as long as your cup, quote unquote, doesn't overfill, you can adapt successfully to that stress. But if you're overfilling that at any one time, you're starting to get a failure to adapt. And if you do that enough, we can start causing problems with, disease and many things like that. So, if my cup is already full for many other reasons, and we'll talk about that here in a second, and then I decide, hey, I just want to do I want to do a real hard training session. I want to do 10 rolls right in a row. Mm-hmm. That's where we can get into trouble because we're not really paying attention to what's already filling up our cup. Does that make sense?
Because maybe you would do that on a day where you had a real cruddy day, bunch of
totally
stuff happened. You're like, I'm gonna get it out in the gym.
Well, and that's a good point too. There is some. Again, that's where the dose comes in, where
It might not be completely beneficial to do that, is what.
Not always, but maybe a little bit may be actually beneficial for you, right? Just to kind of blow off some of that steam, but overdoing it. But that goes back to some training principles when we look at training human beings. there's a continuum in training. If you think about it as an arrow going left to right, where you have undertraining, where you're not giving your body enough input or stimulus to make an adaptation, right? So your body's like, I can deal with that. I don't need to change, right? So that's an undertraining stimulus. You move next to like an acute overload, where you've exceeded, you're trying to push the limits a little bit on what your body can handle. And it's like, okay, here's something we haven't dealt with, whether it's progressive load and lifting, doing more rounds in jiu-jitsu. So then you'll have a positive adaptation to that with not much recovery needed. Again, this is a series of increasing doses of exercise. This is in the sports training and personal training literature, where after we have that one, we go into what's called overreaching, where I kind of overdid it that day, okay, which sometimes isn't bad as long as you give enough recovery between those times. Sometimes pushing it to the limit once or twice, or infrequently, will have some performance benefits, but you gotta look at, it just requires more recovery. If you keep doing that, if you overreach too often, then we can get into what's called overtraining syndrome.
This sounds a lot like Andrew and his Mimos burritos.
Okay, talk to me about that.
He constantly just overdoes it.
I see.
And by the time he finishes the burrito, he sends me a video message and says, I just overdid it.
Yep.
I overdid it.
And if he did that day in and day out,
which he's done,
then we have a failure to adapt. Guess
he
what?
Stops rolling.
Well, and not only that, what about the problems with metabolism over time? We start getting, your body is unable to adapt.
I mean, we've all seen the little bit of gyno that he's starting to get.
Dude. I know. I want to see how deep the hole is you're going to dig. It's really entertaining for me.
I'm his friend.
I know.
I'm here to say something.
Yeah.
I just don't know how to tell him.
Yeah, I like the fact
you felt the podcast was the proper venue
to have an intervention when he's not here.
It's not an intervention.
Okay.
It's just a friend talking to a friend. Your notes.
But it's a good example
of overdoing
it. And it could not only exercise, it could be many things, like you said. And we'll talk more about that here in a second. But, many of us, and I've had questions about this, where after talking to the person, I'm like, oh, you're starting to have an overtraining syndrome, where how do you know when you're there? You basically it starts with an imbalance of your training load and recovery. There's some people say, well, it's not really overtraining, it's under recovery. Semantics, and I understand why they say that, because you can train hard as you want, as long as you're able to give your body enough time to recover from that. So a lot of people will say there's no such thing as overtraining, there's such thing as under recovery.
But you could still get this, destroy yourself with not even training a whole lot.
Well, right? We're going to talk about that.
Zero recovery.
That's right. We're going to talk about that. So when your training load accumulates over time without proper recovery, your stress cup constantly overflows. In other words, what that means is your body is you're not giving it time to adapt to that load and that input. So the prolonged failure to adapt, which we call in this construct allostatic load, is really what overtraining syndrome is when we talk about allostatic load with exercise, if that makes sense. So you're accumulating a training debt without recovering from it. So what does that do to you? So going back to the stress response, remember the sympathetic dominance we talked about, where the sympathetic nervous system creates initially epinephrine, norepinephrine, the fast response. But that slow response is cortisol. And when you're doing that all the time and you're not giving your body a chance to recover, you start getting what we call sympathetic dominance.
So the working out falls under the slow. side.
Well, initially, while you're working out, you're having the
Okay.
adrenaline, norepinephrine. But if you keep overloading your exercise dose, you're basically living in a state
You're
of
hitting both then. You're
Yeah.
hitting the short, the quick stuff that,
But-
and then
but you're living in a state of sympathetic response where you're not giving your body a chance for
once you're done working out, you're still in a stress, like that slow response.
That's
So,
right.
stress
And if you do that day in and day out without recovering, the brain's like, well, I'm going to keep us in the sympathetic stress response because obviously, dummy, you're doing something that, that we need to be stressed about.
Does that
Yeah.
lead to I think they say adrenal fatigue or HPA
Okay.
axis dysfunction?
Yeah. So adrenal fatigue is a terrible term. But I'm not putting that, I'm not saying that you're terrible for saying that. I'm just saying what happens is you can get a dysfunction, the HPA axis, like you said, and I would include the thyroid in that, where you're just kind of smoking the system, basically.
You said a lot of words there, and I didn't. You said adrenal fatigue.
Yeah. So adrenal fatigue, because that's just thinking that the organ's fatiguing.
Okay. But then you brought up thyroid and something else.
All I'm saying is the better way to saying is what she said second is hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis dysfunction. And I just said HPA axis. In other words, the hypothalamus, the pituitary, the adrenal gland, the parts of the stress response are dysfunctional. I'm just saying, as a physician, I always add thyroid into that little sequence because it's involved with that whole system. That's all I was saying. Thank you for making me back up on that. But the problem is, the bottom line is overtraining or under recovery, wherever you want to call it, keeps us in a sympathetic dominance, a low-level flight or fight most of our time when we're not supposed to live like that. And so then we start having health consequences, performance consequences, and even body composition problems, where we start getting you can see that in a perfect example of marathon runners that have overtrained. They're ultra skinny, and they got a little bit of body fat. You can see they got a little bit of body fat around the midsection. Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's a cortisol response. And so it's interesting. So,
Did you say marathon runners?
yeah.
Yeah, I read about that they're
Not
you always
always.
think that they're super healthy, but actually the stress from all that running actually.
Yeah, that's not, and that's
I always consider stress as a mental thing. So this is just, maybe they're not even feeling it mentally. It's just their body. Stress and releasing that cortisol and holding
big time.
some fat.
They're trying to, and it's muscle wasting the whole 9 yards. I'm not coming up because there's proper ways to train for marathon.
Sure.
I'm just saying a lot of runners tend to, because running feels good to them. They get endorphin hit from it, and they enjoy it. So,
Could this be why I'm fairly lean, but I would think I would have maybe like the riblets would pop a little bit more. Mm-hmm. Is that possibly why?
Maybe. It could also be some of your dietary indiscretion.
I gotta bring up old stuff.
Is it old, Bill?
But it's not old because it relates to this because it's part of your stress cup.
Okay, we're not talking about me.
Okay. You brought it up, man. You started talking about your riblets. So,
Can I ask a
yeah,
question?
of course.
It's kind of from left field, but you know how you're talking about being in a sympathetic state?
Mm-hmm.
I read that caffeine puts you in a sympathetic state and that the half-life makes it so that by the next time you have a cup of coffee again, you still have 12 and a half hours worth of caffeine in your body. So you're just always in a sympathetic state from it.
Well, the half-life of caffeine, it's not that long, but you absolutely are stimulating the sympathetic nervous system. That's absolutely what a stimulant does, like caffeine or cocaine or methamphetamine. Mm-hmm. Yeah. That is absolutely hijacking the sympathetic nervous system. That's right. And that's why you get alert with it. And that's why people crash off of it. They get hooked into this. I mean, when I was in the military, I was on 2 to 3 pots of coffee a day just to survive, basically. So tired and just for many reasons. But when I got off of that, it was miserable.
What's that drug that writers use? It's for like ADD people.
Adderall?
Yeah, like Adderall.
Yeah.
Well, that's basically methamphetamine.
Right.
Yeah, so it's a stimulant. But all those are stimulants. And you see people that are taking that, a lot of times they are having trouble gaining body mass, and, there's all kinds of, higher blood pressure, things like that. Okay. So something that you can pay attention to, like for if you, a classic thing for overtraining is, especially for people like us that love jujitsu, if you're having one of those days, you're like, I'm not really feeling like training today, like no interest, higher resting heart rate, generalized fatigue, I would really pay attention to that at that point. And, your brain's trying to tell you something at that point. So
I'm right.
Yeah, you're exactly right. And remember, theoretically, but let's talk about that because it's going to change depending on who you are. And it's going to change.
Talk about it.
We are going to talk about it very quickly here. But I want to, this is really, really important. Not only because we're talking about overtraining right now, but allostatic load, in other words, exceeding your body's ability to adapt day to day for a prolonged period of time, and all that sympathetic dominance that comes with it, and cortisol response chronically leads to other health conditions too: diabetes, obesity, muscle wasting, heart disease, depression, anxiety, high blood pressure, and even cancer. Perfect example is shift work, where circadian disruption, you're messing with your light dark cycles, and you work a night shift. That alone is classified as a carcinogen, cancer causing. Shift work itself. Shift workers have an increased risk of, all things else being equal, diabetes, heart disease, all these chronic diseases because of this allostatic load, because their body is not able to adapt to it. I've had shift workers that go from third shift to first shift, do nothing else, and all of a sudden aren't pre-diabetic anymore.
Dang.
Yeah, that's how powerful that is. And we'll talk about that. Sleep is part of the stress cup, and we'll talk about that here shortly. Before we get into the nitty gritty, I know you're anxious to start talking about this.
This microphone.
What is the mechanism? How does it cause, diabetes and high blood pressure and heart disease? This allostatic load and this sympathetic nervous system dominance.
Yeah.
What ends up happening is you end up creating a low-level inflammatory state and low-level oxidative stress all the time. You've heard of oxidative stress, free radical formation.
You went
free
deeper and
So
confused me more.
no, that's okay. Oxidative stress is when you in chemistry, when you form an unpaired electron, it's very reactive and it starts trying to glom onto other things and actually causes damage. Oxidative stress is created in low-level inflammation by overactive sympathetic nervous system, and a lot of other issues too. But the bottom line is long-term of both of those creates, all these chronic diseases. And that's the mechanism behind it. And that's all I wanted to, really what I wanted to say on that. But if you're able to manage your stress, and that's including, all forms of stress, to where day to day your body can adapt, that's when you get some really good effects from it, where, better performance, muscle growth, all those things we accept, we think are healthy as long as you can manage that. So let's see. Here we go. We're going to start talking about. So this is where I want you guys to think about things. When we ask those initial questions at the beginning of the podcast, what is my optimum dose of exercise? How often should I exercise? What intensity? All those things. You have to take a step back and do a self-assessment. What is filling your own stress cup? And what is the size of your stress cup? And so what we're going to do, Bill.
Can I just
Yeah,
inject?
Please.
You want to know what in high school, you have your senior picture.
Yep.
And then below it, you get a senior quote.
Mm-hmm.
You know that? it's kind of funny.
Well, they only had typewriters back when I was in high school.
That's a darn shame. Well, there's a new thing called a computer and a printing press.
Got it.
It's done wonders for the world. I had my quote that was from Braveheart. And it was from a very family moment when there's a son and his father and William Wallace, and he's talking about, we'll make spears twice as long as a man.
I know the quote very well.
And then
it's like some men are longer than others. Yep. Your mother's been telling stories about me.
Your mother's been telling you stories about me.
Yeah, it's one of my favorite movies.
I mean,
is that your quote?
Well, yeah, because you just said something about
the size of your stress cup.
Yeah, some are larger than others.
They are.
I'm a child, so I just thought of that.
I love where you went with that.
I peaked in high school. We could just bring that up for a second.
Yeah, and we'll illustrate that probably here soon. So let's talk about stress cups.
Okay.
And Olivia, we have a little demo set up.
These, right?
You can if you want.
Okay.
So
you can stay on the mic and I'll just.
Yeah. So you can be like Vanna White here. I have 3 cups that are in front. Right. And you can see they're different sizes. It's closer to Bill is a larger one. Naturally. There's a medium one, and there's a small one. On my side. Well, I did that for a reason. Okay. Now let's take someone, we all know those people listening to this podcast. They're like 22, live in mom's basement, don't have a job, train jujitsu full time. Really don't have a lot of stress in their life. And plus they're in their early 20s. That's the size of their stress cup right there. And they're like, hey bro, yeah, for audio listeners. And we'll probably create a little, maybe a little clip for YouTube, like a short one where people just want to see this visual, because it's very visual, and I think it's important to get the concept. But anyway, that's that person, and they're like, hey, bro, I can train twice a day, no problem, 6 days a week. Yeah, I'm sure you can, because guess what? They got very little filling this sucker up. So if we take this and put their exercise in, Bill, go ahead and give him a little exercise into his stress cup.
You're gonna tell me how much exercise?
Yeah, give him about a quarter. Hey, you can stop there. All right, that's his morning workout. He's got nothing else going on. Now we're going to do the evening jiu-jitsu session. No, same one, because we'll use the green for exercise. Why not?
We're going to do some green exercise.
Yeah. So this is the 22-year-old living in mom's basement with no job. There we go. And stop. He still has some capacity left. And so when he goes to sleep at night, no other stresses in his life, wakes up the next morning, there he is again. So, but we're going to juxtapose that with a couple little case studies. I just want to give you an example where someone with their capacity for stress, because they're young, they don't have a lot of other stressors, they can tolerate stressors and recover from it. You don't have to pour right now.
I'm ready to pour.
Well, yeah, I can see that. But then you go to maybe, let's say Bill's getting close to being 40. Just by age and the fact that he's an entrepreneur, has his own business, has a mortgage, has bills, so he already has. Let's pull a little red in there, man. Yeah.
What does red indicate?
It can just be other sources of stress. Okay, we're not even talking about working out yet. No, let's fill it halfway. There you go. So you're kind of walking around just do your daily life. And, we could increase it a little more due to your Dairy Queen habit. There you go. So that's your body still has to deal with that little, some of the fast food there. Well, then here's what you have left day to day for exercise. And go ahead and pour a little bit more of that in there. Yeah, stop. Okay. And
you can
Well, yeah. Well, my point is the reason why, when we mix it, the colors blend together, right? Because the body doesn't differentiate between types of stress. And that's the whole point of this, is that we need to look at all sources of it. And let's say you had a good night's sleep and you can do another little session at night.
How is your sleep, Bill?
Let's just say he did have a good one. There you go. So you're able to do both those training sessions. Maybe you backed off a little bit at night, but you still didn't overflow things. Okay. Then the next day,
Careful.
yeah. But since you're almost 40 and you have all those other responsibilities, there you are again.
You didn't pour it all out.
I didn't, because it's only been a day.
Okay.
Okay. Where 22-year-old can basically, he's almost like clean, and they have sources of stress too, but for the demonstration,
Sure.
it's kind of a clean slate here. You got other stuff still going on.
Right.
But let's say today you had a crappy night of sleep. Go ahead and fill that up about 3/4.
The
Yeah.
very burgundy black almost.
Yeah, it's purple.
what we call
more. Oh no, hold on a second. Let's open up this little stress cup here a little bit.
Because it's pouring on.
There you go.
Pour it on.
There we go. So now stop. Okay, now you're starting today. First of all, your cup's not as big. The bottom line is, as we age, we just don't have the capacity to deal with it. Some better than others. We'll talk about the differences between someone that's trained all their life and someone that does nothing, right? So you still have a moderately good-sized stress cup. But here's the room you have today for your exercise.
That's like a quarter.
I know. And if you did that, your normal one, what you did the previous day, keep going, stop. And so that's just their first, and let's say, I want to get a 2-a-day in. Let's say you did that. We're not going to make a mess here.
Okay.
You would overflow. Okay. And let's say you did this consistently and you're not sleeping well the next day.
Oh,
You're here,
it's
barely emptied.
2/3.
So
more.
my point is you have to really look at where you're at day to day with this stuff, who you are, what else is going on with your life. Because if you keep overfilling this, even though exercise is good, and I'm not saying do none, but today would be a day to do, hey, let's do some mobility, maybe some drilling. Right. So then you can still get some adaptation in, still some of the beneficial effects
Pour a
without,
little in.
you can. So you just put a tiny bit in there.
A little drilling.
And so,
Some call it flow roll.
well, some people's flow rolling is 120%. So, but that would have been the proper dose of exercise that day. Now, let's say you took 2 days off, you got really good sleep, work is going well. You see what I'm saying?
Now the cup is empty.
That's right. And now you can kind of hit it a little bit more from that. Now, here's Mr. 52-year-old here.
It's a tiny little guy.
Yeah. It doesn't mean I have a job as a physician. I mean, we might as well fill that sucker up a little bit.
Humble brag.
Yeah. Keep going. There you go. So, and assuming I slept well,
So
I
now
can
the
still-
small cup is almost half full
that's right. And it's not as much stress,
from the red,
which could be a variety of stresses.
just kind of life.
Work stress, who knows? And depending on day to day, I could have more or less than that. I still have the ability to perform, and I'm not saying as you get older, this means you can't perform well. I'm just meaning I have to watch my dose of what I do.
Quantity. More
So because if I hit it hard,
exercise green.
yeah, let's say I do,
Go after it.
yeah, even more, almost to the top.
You roll with me twice.
Yeah, exactly. And Gian and a couple of other savages. I'm almost full. And let's say the next day, I slept badly.
Purple drank.
Keep going, because I don't do well. Stop.
Would the red also signify diet?
Sure.
Okay.
Yep. I have very little to play with here.
Right. It's almost completely full.
That's right.
After.
And you notice I didn't recover, and I don't empty that thing as well as this person over here, this big stress cup and the 22-year-old without a job that doesn't have a care in the world pretty much.
Right.
So understanding who you are is really important. Now, if I didn't exercise and I had diabetes and other things of allostatic load, like I didn't really take care of myself, I would have like a Dixie cup. And a lot of us my age are running around with little Dixie cups for stress cups, and they're already filled up with bad diet, lack of activity. Because lack of activity in a human body, the complete absence of a stressor is actually a stressor itself too. If you think about it, you're not getting a positive adaptation to the environment. So as this decreases more and more, and that's why, older people, when they get sick or in the hospital or fall and break a hip, they've really don't have that resilience to bounce back from that. And that's why it's really important. Now, if someone in their 40s came in, I'll just dump this for real quick. They came into jiu-jitsu, never really exercised in their life, really have a crappy diet. And they started getting their diet under control. They were exercising well. They're watching their stress. They actually can move up a little bit to this one. So they've built some resilience into the system. They'll never, because of their age, they're never going to get back to this because that's just part of aging. Right. But they at least can kind of change their size a little bit to allow for a little bit more because they've never done anything. So they'll have a drastic change from that. What I'm trying to do is hold on to this sucker right here and really trying to manage this the best I can. And we're going to talk about that here in a second. Does that make sense so far?
Yeah, it kind of feels like this was a whole big ruse to have an excuse of why I pass your guard at will.
Yes.
As long as it's
Well, actually, because you were bringing up, like if someone has underlying conditions and stuff like that.
Yep.
That would affect how much they could exercise, right? Or handle necessarily, unless they get their other stuff together. Right?
Correct. Because if you take someone, an obese person with diabetes, and you trash them in like one of those Biggest Loser things, it's terrible for them. And they're not going to, you look at, I'm using that as an example because it's a really good one. If you look at almost every contestant that is so-called quote unquote won that, you look at them a year later, that did not do them any favors. They're back to a lot, they
even more than
and because you can get that person to be able to, you can change their life and move them from a small to, a relatively good size cup, so to speak, and be able to tolerate a lot more because now they're not having, diabetes itself. We can just basically fill up your stress cup 3/4 of the way. Because there's not just, because we're not just talking about external stresses from the environment. There's also internal stresses. Diabetes, by definition, is allostatic load. It's a failure to adapt to a terrible diet and other lifestyle factors.
so if you're pre-diabetic,
you're on your way.
There's probably already exists, like that stress is happening on the daily naturally, like a diabetic, just not to the severity.
Not yet, but you're on that road. And that's exactly. So I know we're getting long in the tooth on this, but I think it's important to do a little case study real quick. Let's say we have a 40-year-old male, and I just want you to kind of play a little game with me, Bill. We're going to have a 40-year-old male, high-stress job. He already has type 2 diabetes, high blood pressure. He doesn't sleep well, has financial worries, and he's sedentary. What's his stress cup? No, first, what's his stress cup?
He's got to be the small one.
Yeah, exactly.
He can't even handle a lot, right?
No, he can't. And what are his stresses?
It's got a lot of
You could do
life.
That's right. Life stresses,
But that's
financial
this
worries.
one's got to be way up there.
Yeah, yes.
Poor diet.
Poor diet. He already has type 2 diabetes. Poor sleep. You could fill it up with this one too, but you get the idea. We're basically filling this guy's cup up all the way. Okay. Now, he wants to start jiu-jitsu.
Okay.
And he comes in, Bill, you're a coach now. He comes into your morning class. That's the time he has to train. He's like, hey, how much should I train?
Mm-hmm.
And you ask him a couple questions. Hey, you got any health problems? So ever trained before? Hey, you're, obviously he doesn't look like he's
Right.
in decent shape. And you could then, as a good coach, say, hey, we'll need to start you off a little slower here as far as your input and intensity.
Let me get you a couple times a week, but just be consistent.
Be consistent. Hey, and we have a podcast talking about some nutrition stuff if you ever want to look into that. All these things to help build this guy a better stress cup. And then we can start gradually increasing this, as we kind of take some of these loads away from him. Yeah. Okay. That's that guy, the 40-year-old male. Okay. Now we're going to have a 45-year-old female, so older, but minimal work stress, good sleep, no chronic disease, meditates regularly, and generally is coming in with a high fitness level also. Where would you put her stress cup?
How old is she?
45.
She's going to be a medium.
Yeah, I would say so too. And we could argue about, we could have like 6 different sizes,
sure.
right? So she doesn't have much at all, right? So she has a lot more room for this green. Yeah, we'll all have a little bit. She has a job, but minimal work stress. And she sleeps well and doesn't have any chronic diseases and eats well. Already has a good fitness level. You're going to be able to train her differently. She's going to be able to do more frequently, can bump up the intensity a little more, and we're going to train her differently without getting into near as much trouble as this other guy did. So we want to give the dose of exercise, in this case grappling, and also, hey, how much can I do exercise outside of it? You see, this all kind of goes into the cup. So remember what we're talking about with this. We're dosing exercise, and that's the concept of hormesis. You guys heard about that before?
Ooh. I feel like I've heard her say the word.
Yeah, I'm throwing a bunch
She
of
probably does.
jargon at you guys. I know probably Olivia does.
Do you know it?
Not at the top of
Well, it's okay. The bottom line is it's from toxicology, where we take a minimal dose of something that's normally stressful or harmful, and it has a positive benefit. Perfect example, UV radiation from sunlight. In a proper dose, we get vitamin D production. It upregulates our DNA repair mechanisms. Has a lot of good benefits to our body. But if we stay out there and we have like light skin to where we burn all the time, that thing that could have been good at a lower dose then can cause skin cancer at higher. And you could use that example for anything. Exercise is a hormetic response. Another good one that Olivia and I have talked about before is those plant chemicals, those polyphenols, sulforaphane, all these things are supposed to be good for you in plants. Many of them are actually anti-predation chemicals. They're plant toxins to prevent insects and other herbivores from eating them. Humans, for some people, many people, when you eat those, they don't act as antioxidants. They actually act as a stressor to our system, where a low dose of them will upregulate, so increase our body's natural defense mechanisms to antioxidants. So it has a positive beneficial effect of something that is a toxin, basically. So that's what hormesis is. And so when we talk about in toxicology, we talk about the dose is, the poison is in the dose. There are things like digitalis that typically used as heart medications at low doses that can have beneficial effects. At high doses, they can be deadly. So all these stressors are looked at, the beneficial ones, whether you're doing cold plunges, sauna, all these inputs are stressors to the body that if you stay within your stress cup, they can provide you beneficial adaptations. If you overdo them, too much of a good thing, so to speak, then they're bad. And that's basically what hormesis is. And so the idea would be we want to hit that window, so to speak. We call it a hormetic window. In other words, I'm going to dose something like exercise to hit it in that optimal dose. To stay within my stress cup and then have the beneficial responses to that. Here's the important point. Bill, what may be for you, let's use your middle cup again. Mm-hmm. Right now, let's say this is where you are, very low stress. What may be a good optimal dose today, go ahead and fill it up with the green exercise. You can do a lot today. So that was a big dose of exercise today. So what may have been good today,
it's almost 2/3 full on the cup.
Tomorrow,
poured it out. Now it's about half.
About half. You're not starting out. You're starting out with increased stress. So the hormetic beneficial dose today is going to be less.
So when I try to train the same amount.
That's right, because you have to have that awareness. And we're going to talk about how you know, or some good ways to know how we can dose that. And going back to our exercise program that we just put out.
On the YouTube page.
On the YouTube page, shameless plug. But you notice that I was very clear about not going to failure. And when you slow that explosive rep, you're done. That's a built-in mechanism to make sure that day to day you stay within. It's basically a built-in, because your nervous system is like, hey, today I'm not doing as well. So if you're disciplined enough to stop at that point, then you know you got the right dose that day. Where next week you may be able to do a much higher dose. So it's day to day. And that's really important, because if you overfill this constantly, not only are you not going to get that adaptive anabolic building response to exercise, you're going to start getting catabolic. In other words, that sympathetic nervous system and all that cortisol all the time will start muscle wasting. Your performance is going to decrease and all that. So that's why it's so important to set the proper dose. And we really have to look at dosing exercise like we do with a pharmaceutical. I mean, and with everything. So that's kind of the point to that. Let's see where we're going.
Did you hear that, Bill? Less sometimes is more.
Right. And so, I in the PowerPoint, which we're going to make available to everyone to download, we have a lot of visual representations here and some case studies. We've already gone through a couple of these case studies where you can kind of look. I have another one that's a white belt with a high-stress job, type 2 diabetes, poor sleep, financial worries, where you should, you as a coach, you can say, or a friend, say, yeah, what's their stress cup look like? What's probably filling it? And then
you had said something about someone that's been training for a long time.
Yeah.
So obviously, if they're training a long time, this exercise, the green juice is gonna. Is it basically they can handle more of the green juice than they could maybe even like the red, which is just life stress?
No, you got to look at, no, that's a good question. This is all the same.
Okay.
It's all sources of stress.
Okay.
Yeah. It's how you manage those. And then that's what we're going to talk about after all this is then how do you manage those other sources of stress to allow you to train more, right? Because that's a really good point. What will happen to someone with training for a long time, building up efficiency and movement, not getting themselves beat up enough, is their stress cup is a little bigger and they're able to tolerate a little more than that. Here's another good case study, like a 30-year-old female. Olivia, I'm going to have you do this one. She's a purple belt, type A personality, poor sleep from worrying all the time, and is on a low-carb, calorie-restricted diet and doing intermittent fasting. And this person also trains 4 to 5 days per week at all costs, no matter what. So what are we looking at with her stress cup?
Honestly, I'd probably do the smallest cup.
Yeah, because she's 30, probably not. But yeah, probably has like in the medium here. And there's no right or wrong answer to this. But if we had to, but you know, so we have poor sleep. And what does a type A personality mean to you guys?
Perfectionist.
That's right. And usually they're anxious people.
Yes.
So let's fill that one up. And here's a point I wanted to make today. Hold that right where you got it. Low calorie intermittent fasting. Okay, intermittent fasting can be a great intervention, but it's a stress to the body. It's a hormetic stress to the body. It's also a stress.
And she's a female.
Yep.
That makes it even harder.
And she's trying to, now stop. Now she's trying to train 4 to 5 days a week without a lot of recovery at all costs. So you think she's overflowing that thing?
Yep.
Yeah, that's right. And so again, and this is for people that are running academies too. You know, you don't want to get in everyone's business, but you know, if they come to you for some advice on stuff, this is really helpful to kind of break some stuff down and get them to understand that they aren't doing themselves any good. That combination of calorie restriction, a very high intensity exercise program, poor sleep, and just basically that perfectionist mentality, that stress cup's already pretty full. And so then you know, educate them like, hey, you really need to feed that activity. If you remember us talking with Brittany, what was happening with her after jiu-jitsu?
With her glucose?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Crashing.
Right. It was never.
She was underfeeding,
Yeah.
which was contributing to her allostatic load.
Got it.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And long term, that's going to put her in this it would have put her in a sympathetic dominant state more than it should, and making it really hard to mobilize body fat and lose weight because she's in a stress response the whole time. So that was why that was so important. And people were like, well, how can you tell her to eat more to lose weight, right? Well, we're not talking about losing. We're talking about body composition change and metabolic health. So anyway, so it's really important for everyone to kind of look kind of analyze yourself like day to day. What's the size of the stress cup and what are the things driving that? Now, a lot of people are like, oh, that's all good. That's all subjective. You know, we're kind of, cool concepts and all, but I want some numbers. Okay. And what are some pretty easy ways to day to day kind of estimate where you're at in your stress cup, your allostatic load? Rhetorical question again. One of the ones I like, so I'll tell you what I've played with before in the past. I used heart rate variability before. People have heard about that. I think that concept is fantastic. If you guys ever want to geek out on this, go look at Joel Jamison's stuff. He's an MMA strength and conditioning coach, a really smart guy, has a whole system for measuring heart rate variability called Morpheus. I think it's great. The problem is it's complex in really, at least for many people, of dialing in, you know, how to use it effectively day to day. It can certainly be done. I think it's getting better and better as years go by. It still requires some investment in, you know, some equipment. At this point, I think it's a really good one to look at, and we'll talk about that in the future, what heart rate variability actually is, but we don't need to go down there now. But that's being used a lot as far as gauging allostatic load. Okay. What I like, a nice simple one that I first read about from Charles Poliquin, the late Charles Poliquin, strength coach, really smart guy, is he started using grip strength. So why would we use grip strength as a measure of kind of the state of the nervous system? Anybody have any thoughts on that?
I mean, I just heard Peter Attia talk about.
Oh, yeah, he's great too. Yeah.
Being, indicator of longevity of
That's
life.
All-cause mortality.
All-cause mortality. It's a kind of a different topic, but yeah, that is a really good correlate for all-cause mortality too. It's basically a measure of frailty. I'm using it day to day and even in an athlete. So one of the reasons why grip strength is important and I want you guys to look this term up. It's a little creepy. It's called a homunculus, and it's spelled HOMUNCULUS, and it's basically a physical representation of what the human body would look like if it was proportional to the amount of brain responsible for controlling each part. Okay. There is a huge portion of brain devoted to controlling hands, both motor and sensory. Can you imagine? Hands are amazing what they can do, the fine motor skills. It takes a lot of brain power.
Even without kind of
the touch. You ever notice why does a paper cut hurt so bad? I could do that same cut on my arm and it doesn't hurt near as bad as it does on a finger. That's the threat response. That is because of the representation of the brain and how big of mapping that is on the brain. And grip strength also, because it takes so much of the brain to kind of mess with the hands and operate the hands, it's kind of a good surrogate for the state of the nervous system. So if your grip, what I always tell people to do, and this is right from Poliquin's work, is when you're feeling really good, feeling rested, like you're on vacation, you guys can go to Amazon or somewhere and get one of those little dynamometers. They're little grip strength testers. You basically squeeze them and it gives you a little reading.
I think we've done that, right?
Yeah, we have one.
Usually has pounds and kilograms, whatever you want to use as your measure. But get a baseline where you're feeling good. First thing in the morning, get a good max squeeze. It doesn't have to be both hands, whatever your dominant hand's fine. And just kind of get an idea where you're at. And obviously, if you're doing something to strain, to like with jiu-jitsu, from a white belt to purple belt, I guarantee you someone's grip strength is going to increase. So periodically redo your baseline, see where you're kind of at. The point is, though, what he was talking about doing is using that to kind of plan your training for the day. So if I did a hard training session the night before and I woke up and my grip strength, he used about a 2 kilogram drop, which 2.2 pounds per kilogram, 4.5 pound drop in your grip strength should kind of give you a clue like, hey, I'm not fully recovered. My nervous system is still not quite there. It's fatigued, basically. A 4 kilogram drop, which is almost 9 pounds, you should really, in his view, you should really consider, like making that a super light day. You're not really recovered. You're starting to get in that danger. It's basically a measure of your load, your training load, basically. And that can kind of inform what you want to do. Let's say, I'm not saying do nothing, but maybe do an active recovery day or something like that if it's dropping. But it's a really kind of low-tech, kind of easy way to kind of see where your nervous system's at.
Pretty accurate.
Yeah. I mean, all this stuff, unfortunately, there hadn't been a ton of research on this, but but in the strength and conditioning world, and even in gerontology, the study of aging, they do look at grip strength quite a bit. Yeah, and
they're like the main ones, right? That are kind of pushing that is the age people
for sure, for different reasons. Yeah. For us, though, I think in my experience, it's been a pretty darn good indication on where I'm at day to day. Now
we were doing that. We were testing that for a little bit.
Mm-hmm. It's kind of cool. And you guys can play with that. Another one that doesn't have a lot of research behind it, Andrew Huberman talks about this. If you guys haven't listened to Andrew Huberman's podcast, Huberman Lab, he's a Stanford neurobiologist. He's brilliant.
He's kind of gotten more pub lately because he's been on like Lex Friedman and stuff like that.
Yeah, you guys should listen to his podcast. He has so much interesting stuff on there as far as the neurology and the neuroscience behind this stuff. But
he tried jiu-jitsu too.
Did he?
Yeah.
Wow.
He went and rolled at 10th Planet Austin with Lex.
Good for him.
That's kind of cool.
But him and I think Brian McKenzie, who's a really good strength and conditioning endurance coach, talks about using this test called the carbon dioxide tolerance test. Admittedly, there's not a whole bunch of research out there in the scientific literature, but it makes a lot of sense to me. And this is another thing that I've been playing with, and I think is pretty cool, because when you hold your breath, what makes you want to breathe? Is it lack of oxygen? It's a rhetorical question. I'm setting you up.
I'm wondering. Olivia's got an answer. Oh, no.
What do you think, Olivia?
Oh, I didn't. I was signaling Bill.
I don't know.
So it really isn't oxygen deprivation. It's CO2 buildup. Carbon dioxide builds up. It's a waste product of metabolism. But CO2 builds up and causes the desire to breathe. So free divers have played around with this as a training tool. People that do those breath hold dives, because they want to make sure, they're trying to build up their tolerance to this so they can hold their breath longer. So it's interesting that the CO2 tolerance is very closely tied with the day-to-day state of the nervous system. Have you ever seen someone in a panic attack, anxiety attack? They can't get their breath. They feel like they can't breathe. What do they do for them? They make them breathe into a paper bag.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. They're blowing off way too much CO2 because their CO2 tolerance, because they're in a high anxiety state, their CO2 tolerance is ultra low. They can't hold their breath at all because their nervous system is freaking out like it's in a stress response. And so it wants to take in inappropriately so, and they start over breathing. They breathe out way too much CO2. They can even prolong, you can get an acid-base imbalance. People, they start getting tingly in the lips and all that, and they have them breathe into a bag. Why is that? To kind of recycle, get that CO2, a little bit more CO2 back in there. So using that kind of nervous system correlate with carbon dioxide tolerance, people like Brian McKenzie and Andrew Huberman have talked about using that as an idea of how ready is your nervous system to train? How fatigued are you? What is the state of your stress cup? I guess is a way to put it. So flight or fight response, sympathetic dominance is correlated with a low tolerance for CO2. So in other words, your breath hold, they feel like the urge to breathe much quicker. Where if you're in more of a parasympathetic dominance, like kind of rest and chilled out, you can hold your breath. You have a much higher CO2 tolerance. So what their protocols they've used is kind of interesting. I played with this myself. I really like it. So I'm going to read to you kind of how you determine what your tolerance is. You do this in the morning when you wake up. So people, they say to take 4 full breaths with 1 breath every 5 to 10 seconds, 3 to 5 seconds, slow inhale, pause, and then a very relaxed exhale. You do that 4 breaths. At the top of your 4th inhale, take a full breath, start a timer. Exhale through your nose as slowly as possible. In other words, you're going to try to draw out that exhale as long as you can through your nose, watching your timer. Sometimes you can just close your eyes, and then when you feel the urge to breathe, when you feel like you need to inhale, that's when you stop your timer. And that will give you kind of your day-to-day tolerance. And they've come up with this again. I borrowed this directly from Brian McKenzie's protocol. He kind of gave some criteria for where you're at. Basically, if you're less than 20 seconds, you're in a real high stress state. Okay, and it could be and again, it doesn't matter what the reason is. That's still filling your stress cup. 20 to 40 seconds, moderate to high stress. 40 to 60 seconds, he says that's about adequate. You're doing okay. Some people use this as they actually train their CO2 tolerance where they can get to 60 to 80 seconds where you have really good stress control. You're in a good stress state. People with over 80 seconds in his mind, they have very, very good breathing control. They have excellent pulmonary adaptation, really good, their nervous system's in a really good stress state.
So can you do this, like you have to go off the first time? Because we tried this, was it last night?
Mm-hmm.
Uh-huh.
We did this.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we both had an increase, but I think mine was, how many more seconds was mine the second time? I think the first time I was like 40-something seconds, and then the second time I was...
No, the first time, you mean when you didn't do it correctly? He was like 15 seconds.
Guys, well, if you do it over and over, you're actually training it.
Okay.
So if you think about what's happening during that long exhale, you're actually getting into parasympathetic breathing. So you want to see where you're at your first one. Okay. Have it just kind of the state of your nervous system, because if you do it repeatedly, you're actually doing relaxation breathing.
Yeah.
Where it's just part of recovery and getting your sympathetic. You want to kind of get a snapshot of where
You
you're
just got
at.
to make sure you're doing it right, because I think I didn't take a very deep breath on that fourth
you want
inhale.
You want a full one.
I didn't quite understand that part. I don't know. And it was like 15 seconds. And then I did it the second time. And
you were like 41.
Yeah.
I'm just letting you know I was 44.
I love it. It's not a competition or anything, is it?
What was your first try?
41. My second time was 55.
So again, it's relative. Like, see, you're going to see that too, because the first one's the only one that counts. Because if you keep doing that, you're basically getting yourself into an artificial parasympathetic state where that's not where your nervous system necessarily was at the start.
In the morning.
Yeah, before all the because then you can kind of see where you're at.
Mm-hmm. I'm dying.
No, you're doing okay.
15 seconds of dying.
Well, no, it just if you do it correctly and you get a full breath, you get a baseline, and this is trainable too. So over time, you might want to do another baseline. When you're feeling good. And to see where you're at with this. So the purpose of this stuff is to kind of get some kind of data points to see where you're at day to day. But ultimately, we should really try to start fine-tuning what we're calling interoception. And it's another fancy word meaning, imagine I have an alarm system in my brain, and my brain's constantly monitoring all these inputs from different parts of my body, whether it's my cardiovascular system, my lungs, my gut, my muscles. All this is sensory input coming in, usually on a subconscious level to the brain. It's called interoception, and that gives the brain a readout of the state of the body. Sometimes, many of us are not very accurate at determining that, what's really going on. This is a way to kind of train that, so over time, you can correlate how you're feeling. Like if you had to rate, what is my feeling about training today, with 10 being like, I am just chomping at the bit, I'm feeling great, I want to go train, I'm feeling awesome today, versus 1 where I'm like, I feel terrible, I have no interest in training. So that self-assessment can become more accurate if you can also have some data to back that up. So if I'm having a decreased grip strength and I'm also kind of not feeling so good about training that day, I can say, well, that's probably pretty accurate, as opposed to me just being lazy, right? Because there's a psychological component too, like, I just don't feel like doing that today. Yeah. That's different. It's like, what are you physiologically ready for? And sometimes you can train this system, this interoception system, and over time, have a pretty good intuitive sense on where you're at, because you've done the breath testing or the grip testing enough to correlate this data that I'm seeing with actually what does my own intuition say. So you can sharpen that interoception over time to the point where you probably don't have to do the grip training and the grip testing and all, and the CO2 testing as much. And that's where you get a kind of an intuitive feel of what the state of your stress cup is, which is the whole idea of this whole podcast. So take home messages. That's kind of, it's a lot I threw at everyone. What are your thoughts or questions or comments or anything behind that?
So you barely touched on me being right, and you talked a lot about her being right with our argument about stopping training or training like powering through kind of thing.
I'm a wise man.
So I think that is my battle, is I don't want to be the lazy. Like I want to, I'm siding on just training. Now tapering it back for sure. There's days where I'm like, I'm only going to roll with small people and not very much, like a couple rounds maybe.
But that's great. And so again,
I'm still going to show up. I'm still going to go.
So let's talk about that. That doesn't mean you have to skip class. Mm-hmm. It means I have a real problem when I get to class, and I love it, and I get like caught up in after class. I'm like, I want to just roll hard. Mm-hmm. It takes a lot of effort for me to say, I'm only going to get a couple rolls, and I'm going to pick carefully what do I do today, because I'm not kind of. Yeah. And it's happened to me because I got sick recently because I trained really, really hard.
Will be on the YouTube page
soon. It will be on the YouTube page. Went up against a young purple belt savage. Yeah. It was fantastic, and that's when you kind of respond to what's going on with the roll, and sometimes it's to the detriment of what you're trying to get out of that training session. This is not an excuse not to train, not an excuse to train. So remember, if you don't train hard enough and give the input, you're not going to get the adaptation. I'm just saying when someone asks you, well, how much should I train? It's like all these things, like what you're doing, it's not a question of how many times you're showing up for class. You're altering what you're doing. Mm-hmm. You're not just balls to the wall every single day. And so that's a great way to do it. It doesn't, we can't equate showing up to class, being in class with this. It's not the same input every time. But it sounds like you've gotten, and you'll get an intuitive feel of where you're at. Like, hey, today I think I'm going to do this. I think that's great. I think you figured a lot out. So you're not wrong. Mm-hmm. You would be wrong is if you weren't listening to that and you just had, I got to train this day. I'm training the same way every single time. That's when you can get into danger.
I really notice, I think I mentioned this last time, but especially this week.
Yeah.
The carbs thing after training, it's really big. Partly, so it's Thursday, and I've done 5 training sessions, 2 hours each.
Yeah.
Little cherry on top is the 2 day classes. Casey's come to them. We call him beefcakes.
Yes.
Juggernaut.
Mm-hmm.
What's the Game of Thrones guy that we call him? Thorman or something?
Yeah, giant Spain.
Something like that. Lion's mane mushroom, whatever. It's like that recovery I really need.
Yep.
And just to drive home that's a real thing. If you are training and you're getting, you're pushing yourself, that refeed is crucial.
And I always joke about being older in my 50s as a grappler and training with, 20, 30-year-olds. And, but I have to pay super close attention to my recovery. Mm-hmm. I can only train, and I know this, I can only train 3 days a week without overtraining. Even at,
even managing these other things.
Yeah. Well. And when I'm not managing those things well, which happens too, I end up getting sick, or I just feel like under recovered. I'm not performing well. Yeah. So for older grapplers, you just have to pay attention to who you are and what you're living with, because I could have another 52-year-old that has a completely different source of stress in their life. Their stress cup could be filled up for different things that I don't have to deal with, and vice versa. So, but the bottom line is there's no escaping. The age thing is, look, I'm not going to have that cup the size of a 22-year-old that I had in my 22-year-old self. Yeah. And just learning how to manage that better, and still having a blast training, and still training hard when I need to, but it can't be every training session. Like you'll notice I'll roll, then I'll take a round off. Mm-hmm. I'll roll, then I'll take a round off. Mm-hmm. But when I do blast through several in a row, when I'm feeling pretty good, I do that once in a while, and that can be okay once in a while. So, yeah, good questions.
Liv, I assume you had something.
Yeah, I have a couple.
Okay.
Well, so basically just you talking about you being 50 and having to change things and stuff like that. So that means as we age, we need to be willing to adapt our training based on not only different seasons of our lives, like if you have kids, maybe you're going to have more stress, or if you're working, or, maybe a parent's ill or something like that. Like, and just as you age, you're going to have less, your stress cup's going to shrink.
Yep.
Even if you continue to exercise, it's going to go down a little bit.
It will, right? But yeah, that's true, but not as much as someone that's not exercising.
Yeah.
In other words, my little stress cup here, if I didn't do any of the stuff I'm doing now, eat well, try to sleep, stress reduction, all that stuff, it'd be a little Dixie cup. Mm-hmm. And many of us, you look at life expectancy is not going up right now. Mm-hmm. The next generation is supposed to have even a lower life expectancy than my generation. I'm Gen X. And there are people dying in their 60s. I'm seeing it all the time in the clinic where it's like, and you look at someone, you're like, I'm looking at a 60-year-old, I'm like, they look 80 to me.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And so, yes, my stress cup is smaller than it was when I was 22, but I'm trying to maintain that resiliency as much as I can as I age. And like you said, and adapt my training and my load to make sure my input is still hormetic. In other words, mm-hmm. I'm getting a beneficial response and I'm not going the other way just because I still think I'm 20, even though my mind, sometimes I get in trouble because of that. Because I look in the mirror, I'm like, who is this guy? I don't recognize him, and I hate hearing myself complain about not being able to train, but it's as much as I sometimes would like to, but it's just the reality of it. And it's going to keep me training longer, mm-hmm. as long as I want to, as opposed to being all of a sudden, and you start overflowing that stress cup routinely. Not only do you get sick, but injuries happen. Yeah. So it's a whole thing.
Keeps you healthier. And
totally.
So you can have longevity.
That's right. And that's what, my whole goal in jiu-jitsu now is longevity in the art, period.
Mm-hmm.
What about coming back after you've been sick?
Sickness basically is an allostatic load, especially, if you've had like a flu or something, your stress cup is full. Mm-hmm. I would argue, with some people, you see people that are older, they get sick like that and they go into the hospital pneumonia, they don't come out because they don't have that resilience, right? Mm-hmm. So but let's say you're younger and you're sick, you really have to watch that coming back after sickness and treat it like any other source of stress, because you got to have time for your body to recover, because it's a huge stress fighting off a virus or a bacteria. You've been ramped up. That sympathetic nervous system's been on overdrive for a while.
Because you can back yourself right back into
maybe
not the same kind of sickness.
Not the same kind of sickness, not necessarily getting sick again, but you can overtrain really easily. And you certainly could catch something else, or if you're not fully recovered, And so that is really important, giving yourself even more, like a day or two more than you think,
mm-hmm.
So yeah.
So how Bill was talking about refeeding.
Mm-hmm.
So how does refeeding with something that's not optimal, like a candy bar after working out, because that causes inflammation?
Well,
is it play in a role with the
it does, but let's be honest here. If you have a way to dispose of a lot of that stuff, especially the sugar, mm-hmm. All the additives and stuff, your liver still has a detox, and your body still has to process that stuff. It's not optimal. Mm-hmm. But like right after a hard training session, if you're going to do that stuff, that's the time to do it. I mean, you can kind of suck all that glucose all that sugar into the muscles again. I know people that use like Snicker bars and chocolate milk as a recovery drink.
I'm the Dyson of glucose.
But you don't lose suction, do you?
He does not.
I don't even think that was a Dyson commercial. I think that was the other.
Hoover?
No, there was another vacuum commercial that said, never lose a suction in the 30s. Any kind of food that isn't, optimal as far as, quality, is still a stressor to the mm-hmm. system. But I mean,
if you were going to eat some junk like that.
Yeah.
Like a Red Bull.
Wouldn't the time be after you've done one of these hard workouts?
Totally.
If you were,
you'll have the less impact of all that stuff, but still you're still creating a little bit of a stressor with some of the crud. But But again, know what you're doing. I mean, it's okay. I mean, it's not the worst thing in the world, as opposed to not doing the input of that hard grappling session and then just sitting down and, you know.
Any more brain busters?
Okay, I got one more. Well, because so I was reading your book.
I didn't say it.
Oh, we can't hear it. You got to turn the volume up.
No. Too late.
Okay. Thanks.
Okay. So, and when you're talking about dealing with chronic stress, you do mention mindfulness. Now, I didn't know if you're going to cover that in the recovery part.
Correct. Okay. You're getting ahead of. That's exactly what I want to do. We'll have a whole, a couple podcasts probably on different aspects of recovery and different strategies. Again, it's nice to have this podcast to refer back to, because what we're trying to do basically for recovery is empty that stress cup. Really is what we're doing. And there are ways to absolutely help with that. But the foundations are being smart about it and managing it in the first place. And then using the recovery, some extra recovery kind of protocols to maybe enhance that. But some of the recovery things are also hormetic stressors themselves. You know, sauna, some people like cold plunge and things like that. But remember, that's still adding to your stress cup. So you got to be careful when you do those. And we'll talk about all that. Mm-hmm. But again, that's why I think anyway, it's so valuable to have this kind of conceptual framework here to work with, so we can refer back to that and put all those other things kind of in context. Mm-hmm. Yeah, but we will be doing a lot of stuff on recovery, because it's forefront on my mind. I'll tell you that right now.
Yeah, engaging the parasympathetic.
Yeah, getting more in a parasympathetic dominance is what we're doing. Yeah, we're emptying that stress cup as much as we can day to day.
Okay.
So, a couple listener questions.
Okay.
Some of them fall under the same thing, so I'll just kind of merge them together.
Okay.
And they pretty much all have to do with the strength program.
Okay.
We got quite a few people doing it. And
nice.
Some questions came in regarding it.
Okay.
First, it's the rings are the kind of a big theme, and people wondering what's a good alternative to ring-based exercises if they have no opportunity to put them up in their home. If rings are crucial in the program, what are some tips for budget yet practical setup so they don't have to drill holes in their ceiling or something like that?
Okay. I picked rings very specifically because they really make you create kind of internal stabilization. We talk about, a ring push-up is much different than a regular push-up or a bench press, because you're having to create your own stability. You're firing a bunch of stabilizing muscles in addition to your prime movers. So that is, I think, is pretty crucial for jiu-jitsu to have that type of generate the internal instability. Basically they're unstable, so you have to create stability.
That's why people prefer free weights to Smith machines.
Yeah, exactly. And
and even more so,
with the rings. And you're having a more natural range of movement with your joint than having like a fixed bar that is kind of dictating your movement arc. For the longest time, you guys got to be really careful with this. I had an apartment when I first started using rings. I was renting. I couldn't drill holes in the ceiling or anything like that. I got one of those door gym pull-up bars.
Like $30.
Yep. Yeah. There are ways to kind of anchor them a little better. You just got to be real careful not to do any ballistic movements on those. They are pretty solid, and be careful where you hang them and test them really well. They work real well for rows and ring push-ups. They're a little more challenging with the pull-up.
They're the ones that hang in the door frame, not
the
ones that twist in the door frame.
No, they're the ones that hang on top of it, that wedge themselves in like a cantilever. Yeah, exactly. So I think door gym is like one of the brands that they use. Just be real careful with that, because I've seen people get a little ballistic with them and they kind of pop out. And
Right.
yeah. But I did that for a long time. It gets challenging because of the height of the doorway when you try to do dips, though, because you end up running into your head. It's not optimal.
We're not doing dips in this.
Not
specific-
in phase 2, though. We're going to do pull-ups and dips. So, there are, I actually then moved from a door gym to a freestanding pull-up bar that you can get. It has a bigger footprint, but again, it doesn't require drilling anything.
I assume that's going to be $75, something like that.
If not more, probably more than that. It's an investment, but fitness, I would say, that's a priority for me.
Yeah, it's an investment in yourself.
It really is. Yeah. And so, but I used that next and found a place to kind of set it up in my apartment. It's a little awkward because it has a pretty big footprint, but those things are kind of neat. Freestanding pull-up bars, and you can put like some free weights. They have little ways to weight them down, and that way you can raise it up higher. And I did that for a long time. Mm-hmm. I used that to kind of hang rings from.
And something some people can do is we constantly think that we have to have this bar or something like that to hang this stuff from.
Yeah.
Even if you have a beam that in your garage that you can, I know you do, and
I do.
You can use trusses and stuff like that.
Make a stringer across them. Yeah, there's all kinds of ways to do that. Maybe we can go into my garage and I can show you how I hang my stuff up. You can also, depending on where you live, a good solid tree branch. Yeah. There's ways to do it.
Yeah.
But
okay.
Yeah.
That's good. And we have another question here about, my question is, can you add a stretching routine post-workout, or do you want to do that on a different day from the dynamic workouts?
Yeah, it's a great question. And especially with Andrew and I just going to the functional range systems, static stretching, people have just kind of crapped on for a long time. It has its place.
Which is like where you're pulling, like you get into a stretch and just hold.
Yeah.
Right? That's static stretching.
Right. I'm personally really like the kind of end range isometric stuff that the FRC talks about, where you're actually strengthening these things isometrically. It doesn't have to be 100%, but it's more of a mobility end range strengthening. I like a lot more than just static stretching, because why you ask your question, why are you stretching? Mm-hmm. What's the purpose? Are you trying to increase mobility? Most people are, right? Like, I want to be able to do the splits, or my shoulders aren't moving like they should. Your nervous system isn't going to let that happen very quickly with just you're basically trying to stretch something, and it's tight for a reason. Whether it's weak, especially in certain end ranges, your nervous system doesn't feel safe in those positions, so it won't let it happen. And there's a whole bunch of things with muscle spindles and Golgi tendon organs. They're basically the regulators of muscle length and tension, that your nervous system is not going to allow something it considers dangerous. But if you work these end ranges in these, especially through some of the functional range systems type of approaches, then you build up strength in these places and tell the nervous system, hey, this is safe, and I can achieve this range of motion safely. And I can use that range of motion, not just passively, but I can get it there under its own power. So I think I like doing those before, as we do in our warm-ups. And if you're going to do more of the static hold type stuff, I think that's really nice afterwards.
So if they're going to do, let's say they're doing the phase 1 training, the strength protocol, they can do this a stretching routine before.
I don't like the word, the mobility before, because you're basically, it's going to make your workout probably better too. You're going to have, as far as the nervous system being able to stabilize and kind of waking it up. And I like that before. There's no hard rule. Matter of fact, I have a day. Since I can only train 3 days a week, jiu-jitsu, I take those other days and I do a lot of that. Even sitting in front of the TV, I'll do a couple of the mobility drills.
Okay, if they're mixing in, they're doing the strength training twice a week, let's say, and then they're doing jiu-jitsu 2 or 3 times a week.
Yep.
They can absolutely have some overlap with their mobility.
Absolutely. And then the degree of like the FRS, we can, do these 100% isometric contractions. That can take a lot out of the nervous system too. So I think on your training days, I would do more submaximal.
What's that word mean?
Not maximum.
Okay.
In other words, like 50% effort with that kind of mobility and range.
Got it.
Strength training.
With the FRC stuff.
Yeah. And I encourage everyone to look into that. They have their own.
Was it functional range?
Functional range systems. But they have a whole system for people that's almost like their version of yoga. It's not yoga, but it's their called kin stretch, KIN stretch. It's their kinetic stretching. It's their version of using these principles in more like a flow kind of movement pattern. But anyway, the stuff's great for jiu-jitsu. I'd highly recommend that over just plain static stretching.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good. And the last question is a little bit on it's a dilemma with food and training and timing and stuff like that. We talked about it a little bit with Brittany on, being scared to eat late or something like that. But I'll just read the question. I understand that I need to refuel my body after a hard session of BJJ. But here's the dilemma. They end practice at 7:30 or 8, depending on the amount of rolls that they get on that day. By the time they get home and ready to take a meal, it's 8:39 at best in a good scenario, so maybe even 9:30. They need to be in bed by 10:30 to get up at 6 a.m., and they need to have the best quality of sleep possible. They understand the value of that sleep. As far as I know, this is what their quote, as far as I know, eating within 2 hours before sleep, especially a large meal after practice, would not be ideal and can compromise the quality of sleep. How would they go about without compromising on sleep or eating if going to sleep later and waking up later is not an option? I think I know the answer, but go ahead.
Yeah. So the consequences of not eating afterwards are worse for sleep than refueling, because you're basically going to get into a more of a cortisol response where you're stressed. Your system's like, okay, you're not refeeding after that. Well, I got to do something.
The quality of sleep is going to be just
because cortisol is naturally, we call it diurnal. In other words, it has a pattern throughout the day where it peaks early in the morning. It slowly falls throughout the day, and then at night, it should be at its lowest. And then it peaks in the morning to help you wake up. It's stimulatory. So if you are getting a cortisol response because you're not refeeding, your sleep is going to be even worse, because cortisol is not, if anybody's ever taken prednisone, which is a, it's basically, it's the same thing. It's a pharmaceutical version of cortisol. And they know one of the biggest side effects of that is insomnia. And it's because of that. It's stimulatory. It's a stress response. It puts the nervous system in a stress response. So many would argue that, traditionally, you shouldn't eat after this and this and that, and after a certain time, and it disrupts sleep. It's like, okay, but those people haven't grappled for 2 hours, okay, which I would argue is tough. It's not optimum anyway, right? So and we can talk about that with sleep and what I do with that, but I definitely refeed, because that is the better of the two options, because then my body's like, okay, we've refed. We don't have to get into this stress response to make some more glucose for the brain, right? And then I will use some other things to kind of help calm the nervous system down, that helps me sleep. And by the way, if you do this long enough, there are circadian clocks. In other words, we'll talk about this in sleep and the circadian rhythm system, where each organ system can kind of get trained, honestly, based on what you're doing. And over time, it can get more used to later night feedings if that's what you're doing all the time. It's trying to adapt. Is it optimal? We'd argue, training it, that late for many people is probably not optimal, but you got to get it in, and that, I'm not going to give it up. But not feeding is definitely not the way to go. And we can talk about some things people can do to help kind of get the sympathetic nervous system calm down after training. But part of that is the refeed. And does that make sense?
It does. And you did talk about it a little bit with Brittany about the eating late thing. And it sounds like it's kind of like the BMI issue where we would both probably be considered overweight, if not obese, on the BMI scale.
For sure.
Because of our height and weight. Simply.
Yep.
That's where the whole eating late thing can kind of fall in, is if you're just this normal person that walked 5,000 steps today and went home and, try not to eat at 9 o'clock for sure.
Oh, for sure.
But someone that just did what we do.
Well, that's the problem with blanket recommendations, right? Yeah.
But we've been fed that blanket recommendation from middle school.
I know.
And on TV.
Well, how many of us are grappling for 2 hours in the evening as far as the general population?
Yeah, I mean, it's
not a lot.
Yeah.
And so for our community, there are some give and takes. Ultimately, it'd be great to have a jiu-jitsu class from 4 to 6
that we could all make.
Eat afterwards and then go to sleep at 9:30 or 10.
Yeah.
Right. But that, I'm not going to give up training just because but there is some adaptation that takes place in the circadian system that those organ systems will adapt to some extent. But it's much more important to refeed to prevent that stress response than it is not to, because someone's told you that you shouldn't be eating and it's disrupting sleep. I guarantee you your sleep's going to get disrupted more if you don't eat.
Okay. So, and actually there's a sneak one little question because it's from last week. I did my boy Josh dirty, and we talked about someone having some soreness issues.
Oh, right.
And where after training, they can't even get in the car sometimes. And they are so sore. They take a couple days off. They come back. They feel like $1,000,000.
That was him? Okay, obviously that's not a white belt.
Not a white belt?
No.
And doesn't spaz. And
no, not at all.
Overexert. He's very flowy. And he's a black belt.
And this is where the individual type of assessment comes in, right? When there's a blanket statement like that, and I don't know who this person is and where they're doing. Yeah. So in particular, and I can talk offline with him, but the things I would look at with that is hydration status, big time.
Not just water.
No, with electrolytes. You might want to even do a little bit of amino acid and glucose in a drink.
Maybe.
Yep, with that, right there at the end of training. And I would even consider doing a little bit of light mobility work post-training for maybe 10 minutes.
Okay.
And see if that makes a difference. Because
for the locking up.
For sure. To kind of do some opposite of jiu-jitsu movements. We're jiu-jitsu is very much a flexion type of. We're kind of curled up and all that. Maybe opening some of that stuff up a little bit in an extension, getting some good, hip flexor. All that kind of stuff, and really working in general on mobility. Because if someone is not mobile and the nervous system's fighting the whole time during grappling to try to, when you're trying to get into positions where it doesn't want you to get. You're going to get sore as heck.
Okay.
Joints and muscles, and because it puts a lot of stress on them. I would definitely put a lot of time into maybe increasing mobility in general for someone like that.
So those are the first couple things that you're going to check off the boxes. Okay, what does the hydration look like?
Yep.
A kind of hydration.
Yep.
Not just water.
No, you want to get electrolytes. Probably in that case, give a little bit of glucose. And maybe some amino acids too.
A little sugar,
Yeah.
Okay.
And then some mobility work. Yeah. Okay. I think it'd be good.
Chris, This has been the stress episode, and that's the questions.
Hopefully people won't jump off a building after it's so long. I know.
So we have more common, like, narrated roles coming out. Chris is going to be highlighted in there.
Oh, I can't wait for that one. You guys are going to love that one.
Yep.
I'm sure Bill's going to really do me a lot of favors on his commentary too.
Delightful. I'll send it to my mom. And then we have a cholesterol episode coming up.
We'll do that.
Yep. We have a sleep episode. We're going to be doing another one with Andrew, talking about towards the end of, people, if you started phase 1,
Yep.
we'll be coming up on the end of that, or roughly. So that'll be good. Or if you started late, you'll know what to expect.
Agreed. And we'll also keep sending in questions because, if we get enough of them, we can actually just do a dedicated Q&A episode too, which I think are really valuable for a lot of people.
Yeah, absolutely. And you can send any questions. Either you can private message or DM the Instagram or Facebook, or you can send an email to grapplingwithpodcast@gmail.com.
Love it.
And that's gonna.
And we'll make this PowerPoint available too.
Yeah, I'll put a link to the PowerPoint that he read off all of his notes and stuff like that, and that'll be in the description on YouTube and Spotify and all that.
Excellent. Well, thanks.
Thank you.
You guys, empty those stress cups, and
Empty that cup, buddy. All right.
Later.